Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Dr. Tiia Kuuranne. Listeners, Tiia is director of the Swiss Laboratory for Doping Control Analyses, Adjunct Professor of Pharmacy at the University of Helsinki, and president of the World Association of Anti-Doping Scientists, or WAADS. She is joining us to talk more about her work in the lab, as well as the role of WAADS in promoting clean sport. So Tiia, welcome to our show today. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm fine.
Wonderful. We are excited to have you with us. And I'd love to dive in first into your role there at the Swiss Lab for Doping Control Analyses. So can you tell us more about the lab and what you do there?
Our lab is located in the city of Lausanne, and our host organization is the University Hospital of the Canton of the Vaud, CHUV. It's also part of the legal medicine services. And in our laboratory, we are 30 persons, approximately 30 persons working.
Fantastic. So what does an average day look like for you there?
We, first of all, as an anti-doping laboratory, our daily routine runs around the routine analysis of anti-doping samples, urine and serum blood samples, and then also for the method development and the research activity.
Excellent. And you've spent some time here in the field of anti-doping, but I'm curious, how did you initially get interested in this area of research?
I started my work in an anti-doping laboratory in 1996 as a master's student. I have been graduated from the University of Helsinki from analytical pharmaceutical chemistry. And my professor had a connection to an anti-doping laboratory in Finland. And he proposed me the master topic in the laboratory. So that was the beginning. And since then, I've been working more or less with the project related to anti-doping.
Definitely. And you've been there at the WADA accredited laboratory now for some time. And I know there are a lot of challenges that come up in anti-doping. So for you, what has been the biggest challenge running a WADA accredited anti-doping laboratory?
I think the profile of the work has been changed quite a lot. Now that the analytical sensitivity of the instrument is significantly improved, I would say that the bottlenecks are not in the analytical instrumentation anymore, but it's more like an interpretation of the results and to really include and exclude all the elements which are relevant for the result interpretation. And then harmonization of the laboratories is of high interest today. And this area of analysis or science is highly regulated. And I think it's quite natural when we are dealing with the athletes and their samples, following up all the regulations and updates of the different documents which are implemented to guide the work of the laboratory and the harmonization of the laboratories. I think keeping up with all this information and the interpretation of the results, that's today at least what I've found the most challenging or laborious in the work.
Definitely. And I think this harmonization is so important to ensuring that the samples are dealt with consistently and fairly in laboratories that span around the world. So how do you do this and kind of what are your interactions with the other WADA accredited labs?
We are about 30 laboratories worldwide, and it's a high number of laboratories, but then relatively small. And when everybody has the same operational environment and the same requirements for the performance, that unifies the laboratories a lot. And we need to have the support of one another to make sure that all the knowledge is shared. And of course, it's not only on voluntary basis, but the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, sets also quite high criteria for the performance and also for the networking of the laboratories. So everybody recognizes the needs of sharing the information and harmonization of the methods.
Definitely. And I found that the anti-doping field in general is quite collaborative. Are there other things about working in anti-doping laboratories or working specifically with the Swiss lab that you are finding most enjoyable?
I think it's probably the combination of the joy and the pain is that the work is never completed. There is always new substances appearing in the list of prohibited substances, that the cases are all unique, and we can never just sit back and think that, okay, now everything is done. It's quite a dynamic field of analysis. So what I find interesting is this always changing environment and the competence that needs to be really increased every day.
Absolutely. And in addition to processing this constant stream of samples coming into the lab also does research. So Tiia, can you talk a little bit more about the research side of what's going on there at the Swiss Anti-Doping Lab?
In our laboratory, we have defined the research strategy to 4 major sectors because there are a million interesting things, but to be efficient and to focus the energy and the efforts on something productive, we had to discriminate between all the possibilities. And in our laboratory, the branches of research areas are, first of all, the development of an athlete biological passport, models different modules of that concept, And then we are interested in the improvements of instrument technologies, new sample matrices, everything related to the technical solutions or the advances in the anti-doping. The third branch is the improvement of forensic analysis or forensic tools to be implemented within the anti-doping context, because our environment is quite enjoyable or beneficial for that kind of expertise, because in Lausanne we are surrounded by colleagues who are specialized to this type of analysis in forensic context. And the fourth branch of the research is the gene doping. But these are the main areas of interest.
Very interesting. It sounds like you've got a broad portfolio of research, even though you've narrowed it down a bit from the wide world of anti-doping there. But I guess, is there a project that you have ongoing right now in the lab, Tiia, that you are just so excited about and want to share with me and our listeners today?
I think all of the projects are interesting, and they are at the very different stages of development. Those ones which are the closest ones to implementations are related to the analysis of steroids in blood to support the Pathway Biological Passport module for steroid profiling and misuse of testosterone. This is something which is really close to the implementation in routine analysis. And then everything related to the implementation of new techniques is certainly interesting, because there are innovations or technical solutions which are already implemented in academic unit, but then we need to filter these ideas for the routine analysis and to filter all the academic ideas with our perspective for the routine, and how to defend the cases, how to analyze the samples in routine, and to apply the analysis on the large batch of samples. And I think that's fascinating, to filter the scientific innovations into routine practices to something really practical.
Definitely. And I think this is critical in anti-doping to continuing to advance the field and becoming more and more sophisticated over the years. But this translation from how things work in an academic lab to how they need to work for routine use can be really difficult. So how do you manage that gap or that translation?
I think this is based on the collaboration with selected and good partners. And that's really the fundamental issue of the research today. I think it's really difficult to achieve something significant without the help of the others, or this kind of a collaboration where synergies are put together from very different fields of interest. And I think that's the key element in the academic project or in the scientific projects. And our role is a little bit ugly also, with that sense that sometimes something works in one single analysis or in the academic environment, but then when there are routine restrictions about the time and the sample volume and especially the pricing of the analysis, then some good ideas need to be torpedoed as they are too premature at the moment. But I think to have this source of ideas from the collaborators or the partners, this is fascinating.
Definitely. And you hinted that your lab there is sort of uniquely suited to address some of these questions and improvements in forensic tools. Can you talk a little bit more about this area of the research?
Already our host organization, we work in the unit of the legal medicine, and we get support from our forensic genetics unit. And that's exactly an example of an application of their competence into anti-doping field. We can subcontract some analysis from them to study the authenticity of the urine samples, for example, or other anti-doping samples. And then we are in the lucky position, as I said, to have the competence, for example, the criminal science school in Lausanne. And then, of course, there are a lot of international sports federations quite close to us. And that's also important to realize or to have an impression of the needs of the laboratory services, because at the end of the day, we are delivering the analysis results for some needs or for an end user who is the anti-doping organization. So the more we know about the needs of our partners, the better we can also develop our method. So this kind of a dialogue to prioritize or to coordinate the research project along the priorities, that's important to know the needs from the field.
Absolutely. I think those connections and those conversations are so important to make sure that you're addressing the most pressing things in the world of anti-doping for the people who need them the most. So that's phenomenal that you have these relationships built in there at your organization. And we've touched on your role in the lab, and I'd love to talk about your position there at WAADS as well, the World Association of Anti-Doping Scientists. This may be an organization our listeners may or may not be familiar with. So, Tiia, can you tell us more about what the organization is and who are the members?
The World Association of Anti-Doping Scientists is an association to increase the synergy or the collaboration between the anti-doping laboratories. So for most part of the members are members of the accredited anti-doping laboratories.
Excellent. And how did you initially get involved with WAADS and then ultimately become president of the organization?
I think I heard that for the first time when I was attending the workshop. There's an annual workshop in Cologne for the laboratories, and the directors of the laboratories, for example, are there, and the other members of the WAADS, and that's the environment where the laboratories exchange information and present the research outcomes. And that's also in the normal year. That's the place where the WAADS General Assembly convenes annually. So that was the first place where I heard about the WAADS.
Excellent. And then, of course, you became president of the organization. Can you talk about what that role is and how your experience has been in it?
I think I have been very, very lazy president or bad president because these 2 years that I have been the president have been quite challenging for many sense. And as I mentioned, the network of the laboratories is very close. We know each other. So it's a very tight network. And the position of the president is to, in my opinion, it's to gather the information from the colleagues and probably to translate these ideas or communications, for example, with WADA. WADA is setting the rules or drafting the rules and operational environment for the laboratories. And the expertise of the laboratories is important in drafting technical documents, for example, or these rules which are used to guide the laboratories in the daily work. So the competence of the scientists of the laboratories is of extreme value for drafting the rules properly and to really gain or to put together the practical knowledge and the expertise from the laboratories. And I find personally the position of the president of the association, the person who is combining this information and to communicate to different partners. And the main partner is really the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA.
Definitely. And it sounds like there's this dependency, these relationships between WAADS, between the anti-doping labs, and also between funding organizations. So can you talk about how organizations like the PCC and other funders kind of factor into this equation?
I think this is the way really to spread the information. And the organization like PCC is of an utmost importance for the funding of the research because at national level, the laboratories are competing with public health projects. And then in the big picture, it's extremely difficult to obtain funds from other sources than those who are really dedicated into funding of anti-doping projects. So PCC is really an important partner in that. And I think that the position of the WAADS is, again, to spread the messages between the laboratories and, for example, the funding authorities to make sure that the laboratories are aware of the possibilities to apply for the funds and in the best possible occasion also to these organizations to know what's going on in the laboratory.
Definitely. And WAADS is a really important organization, as you've described here. But can you talk a little bit more about the history and how it all started?
It has started in late 19th. I checked the history of the WAADS. There was the first constitution drafted in 1998. And the first president, Professor David Cohen, was elected as the president in 2001. And by this, I also realized that we have missed our 20th anniversary of the association.
With COVID, we'll excuse it. I know it's been a crazy few years.
I think it's a valid excuse for many things.
Definitely. And I know WAADS, one of the major components of it is a QA program. So can you tell me and our listeners a little bit more about this WAADS QA program and why it's so important?
The QA refers to quality assurance. And this is, as we already spoke earlier about the harmonization of the laboratories. The QA program is one of the tools to share the information between the laboratories and to make sure that we all have the possibility to perform at the same level. For example, there is a laboratory who has access to an excretion study sample of a new substance for which the metabolites are not yet well discovered. The sample can be spread or distributed to all laboratories. We study the sample and we gather the information together to propose the best practices for the analysis and to combine this information of the proposed approach to target the correct metabolites or to use a particular analytical technique to analyze the target substances.
That makes sense. And I think that example really helps us envision how this all works in practice, which is great. And I guess taking a step back and looking at the big picture, you touched on this a little bit, but what role does WAADS play in the global clean sport movement now and maybe in the future as well?
The competence of the laboratory is of everybody's interest. Of course, everybody wants to perform well and to avoid any pitfalls in the analysis. But together we are quite strong, having 30 laboratories who are focusing on the same objective. And we share the same workload, or the job description of the laboratories is the same, even if the operational environment, the countries, the number of persons working, the instrumentation could be different. But the way of harmonizing the work, the analytical work and the result interpretation is really the mutual benefit, because then for the global anti-doping program, it gives an assurance or the credibility to know that the laboratories are performing at the same level. And for the athletes, finally, it's also the assurance that no matter where the athlete is tested and which laboratory is analyzing the samples, the results are the same and comparable. So I think that's the benefit for the whole system.
Definitely. And I guess looking forward to the future, do you have any goals for WAADS or things that you would like to see continue to develop within the organization?
I think this is more related to the communication and the coherence between the laboratories. That within the 2 last years, it's not only the anti-doping laboratories. I think everybody has struggled with different or unexpected problems of having their staff safe and in good health and maintaining the job and to ensure the activities and all these kind of issues. But on top of that, I think really the communication and the transparent transfer of information is something that I would personally like to see to continue. There are new generations coming to work in the laboratory. We have more sensitive instruments and there is more and more automatization, but really to be sure that we maintain our scientific competence and knowledge.
Excellent. And I know there's still a lot of challenges in anti-doping in general to solve. And many of these questions you're working to answer in your own laboratory. But I think oftentimes you're limited when it comes to funding or staff or technology or feasibility or even just time, Tiia. So if we took away all of the barriers, is there one problem in anti-doping science that you would want to solve most?
I think it's really the harmonization. We have tools for everything. We have technologies. We have different applications and solutions and all the software and all kind of tools that are aimed at facilitating our lives. But I think the common strategies, the common philosophy of the things, how to do them and to focus the energy on common goals. It's a bit philosophical and not too practical. And I know it's also not too easy to implement, but the better communication between different stakeholders or different partners to make sure that we don't waste time in duplicating the work or to pull the system to different directions, but to have some kind of a common vision on the objectives and then to focus the efforts to the same direction. I'm not sure if I can explain it clearly, but really to synchronize the efforts and to have the common goals for all the partners of anti-doping. I think that would be something.
Oh, absolutely. I know there are so many stakeholders in anti-doping, whether it's the labs, athletes, the national organizations, the federations. So there are a lot of people to get on the same page. And I think that would be phenomenal. Do you have a sense of what these resources could help you accomplish or steps that you could take to bring us closer to that goal in the future if you had unlimited resources?
It would be really to get together and to open the eyes and ears to see the perspective of the others and to have the time to explain the reasons for certain or the limitations to certain processes. And now I think it's very practical. More and more samples are collected. There are different matrices. There are different approaches for strategies. There are different approaches for the analysis. And the better we can understand the globality, I think the more efficient we could be. From the laboratory perspective, that would be excellent if we have a long-term goal, because the strategic planning takes some time, or it should be done on the longer time span for the investments or method development, all these kind of things. So the better we can anticipate the things, the better we are in implementing the methods which are fit for purpose and that would serve the purpose or the needs of anti-doping organizations also.
Definitely. And I know, Tiia, we covered a lot of ground today. If our listeners want to learn more about your laboratory, more about WAADS, and more about what you do you have any recommendations for where they should go?
My focus is on the scientific contribution because at the end of the day, we are scientists who work in the laboratory. So what we do is we publish our results in scientific journals. I think that's at least a professional way to find about our work. We present our outcomes in the meetings, but of course, that's not always interesting or not available for the public. But as an individual, everybody has their private way to work in the social media, for example, but I'm a more fan of the scientific contribution. So I would say PubMed or any other databases for the scientific publications or research projects.
Excellent. Well, listeners, definitely check out some of the wonderful publications that are coming out of Tiia's lab. And Tiia, it's been so great to chat with you today. We appreciate you joining us on the show.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the chance.
Well, it was a pleasure to speak with you, listeners. Great to have you here as well. If you haven't had a chance yet, we would truly appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform to share your experience with the show. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.